my theme today will be 3 European organizations that are very often confused or mixed up.
I'm sorry, we can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Is it better? Is this better? Is this better? I will move closer to the microphone. I will speak about and relatively briefly about 3 European organizations that are relevant in different ways to the struggle for democracy, respect for human rights, and rule of law. And these 3 organizations are the Council of Europe, the OSCE, and the European Union. One could discuss, I mean, it's clear that the oldest one is the Council of Europe, because the Council of Europe was created in 1949. One can then discuss whether the European Union or OSCE is younger. Of course, the European Union started out in a very small format already in 1950 with the creation of the coal and steel community. That was then broadened to the common market in 1957. And one started to speak about the European communities and the European community. And then in the early 90s, the European communities were transformed into the European Union. The OSCE has an entirely different story. The OSCE was created in the midst of the Cold War. It was an attempt by the hostile sides of Europe to try to form cooperation and understanding, to increase security, also to increase economic exchange, and to increase respect for human rights. The OSCE as an organization stems from 1994, when it was formed as an organization in Budapest. But before that, for some 20 years, there was something called the Helsinki process, meetings that were took place first in Helsinki, and the most important event was the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, when the East and West of Europe, as it were at the time, agreed on a number of common principles and a program for cooperation. In that program of the OSCE, there was a particular basket for human rights. There was another basket for security matters, and there was a basket for economic matters. So these were the themes that the states of Europe talked about. Now, if we look at these 3 organizations, we can note that they are entirely different when it comes to action for democracy, human rights, and rule of law. If I may start by the European Union, it has been there for quite some time, if you include all the previous formations, but it has not dealt with basic European values for more than a few decades. For the first decades, the European Union was an economic organization, and it dealt only with economic matters, or primarily with economic matters. It didn't have a program on rule of law, human rights, etc. It started, in fact, introducing rules or conditions about respect for human rights in its agreements with countries in other continents. There were agreements with Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Caribbean, giving these countries access to the European market on condition that they respected certain basic European values. But it was only in its external activity in the 1980s that the European Union was really paid attention to European values. This changed with the fall of the Eastern Bloc, with the reunification of Europe. But at that time, many states asked for membership, and the members of the European Union decided to have a condition for membership, which was formulated in the so-called Copenhagen criteria. In 1993, in Copenhagen, the European Union set down that in order to be a member of the European Union, there must be certain minimal standards that are observed. And from that time on, any candidate country was measured, was assessed on the basis of its respect for these basic European values. You could say, I think, that the European Union has had a stronger influence over its candidate countries than over its own member states. Because once you are inside the tent, once you are a member of the European Union, there are very few instruments of sanctions, of power, of effect that the Union can use if a country starts to behave in a way that is contrary to European values. And we see some examples of this in Europe right now, when some states, some member states have turned illiberal, have turned clearly have started to flaunt the principles of the rule of law, started to sort of to dismantle the court system, and have in many other ways have tried to backtrack to an authoritarian form of government. The European Union is not terribly powerful in dealing with such tendencies. Going back to the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe was an organization that came up at the end of the Second World War, or after the end of the Second World War. The countries in Western Europe at the time, plus Turkey, started to discuss how to organize Europe in order to prevent a return to authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. It was only Western European states that were admitted to the Council of Europe at this time. And the principles of respect for human rights were laid down in a number of conventions, particularly the most influential one, the European Convention of Human Rights, which was signed in 1950 and then ratified successively by various states. An element in this Convention of Human Rights, which was not compulsory at the beginning, but became more or less compulsory afterwards, was that there should be an individual right of complaint. In other words, that any human being, not only citizens, but any human being that felt that a state that had ratified the convention did not respect its principles, the rights of the individuals. When that happened, you could go to the, first of all, and in the early stage, to the Commission of Human Rights. And if you were not satisfied with the Commission of Human Rights, you could go on to the Court of Human Rights. These bodies were set up in the early 50s, but they were extremely passive and powerless in the first few decades. There were very few cases brought to the Commission and to the Court. But this changed. And in the 1980s particularly, the European citizens started to discover that this was a very influential, very, very effective way of trying to punish their own governments when they had been wronged. So more and more people started to file applications to the first to the Commission. Then in the 90s, the two bodies were fused. The Commission and the Court were fused into a new court, a court with full-time judges. The previous judges had been part-time, only sort of fly in from their home countries. But now there was a permanent court in Strasbourg, a lot of staff to deal with the cases, the applications, and the applications just went up like this, the number of applications. So much so that the court found it very difficult to deal with all these applications. They started to think of ways of somewhat limiting the number of applications they could deal with. Now, Are the verdicts of the court respected? Well, they are very much criticized. Whenever there is a verdict against certain countries, there is a strong reaction, or not in whatever, but in many cases there are strong reactions. But basically, by and by, member states nevertheless tend to respect the courts. And when the court says you should pay a fine, you should pay some compensation, there may be slow movement, but eventually the fine is paid. So although there is a lot of noise about the court, a lot of criticism, you could say that the court is relatively effective in that its judgments are slowly but surely respected by the member states. So I would say that the court is perhaps the strongest, the most efficient body of the Council of Europe, but not the only one. The Council of Europe is a complex of a lot of different bodies. Parliamentary Assembly, a Congress of local and regional authorities, but also a lot of committees of experts in different fields. Some 200 conventions have now been produced by the Council. A handful of these, perhaps a dozen, are compulsory. All member states must ratify these conventions. But the rest are voluntary. You can sign up, or you can opt in, but you needn't opt in if you don't want to. Russian Federation, to take this example, has ratified around 60 of the 200 conventions. Some of the older member states, some more, but no member state has ratified everything, and some of the conventions are dead in the sense that they are no longer topical, so to speak. Anyway, so this is and in the around these conventions there are quite often control bodies, monitoring committees, various institutions, to supervisory committees to check that the engagements, that the commitments that member states take upon themselves are respected. And there are all periodic reports that scrutinize the extent to which member states fulfill their obligations, and very often criticize member states for not fulfilling their obligations. So this is a huge complex of bodies, very often created ad hoc, very often created at more or less sort of from a sort of bottom up, on a bottom up principle. Let me just give you one or two examples. There is a body called Greco, which is a partial agreement on fight against corruption. What does Greco do? Well, Greco has examines all those countries that have ratified this agreement, and they come with criticisms and say, look, you still have a significant corruption problem in your country. You should do the following 14 things, or 150 things. I mean, there are recommendations, and the next time around, next round, they will come back and say, look, 4 years ago, we told you that your system was imperfect in these ways, and you have not yet done anything. So there is a kind of a constant nagging from Greco on these matters. There are similar bodies on fight against xenophobia. There is one. There is on women's position. There is a body called the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission started in Venice, in Italy, and the Venice Commission is a body of experts in constitutional law. Very often, when states are revising their constitution, they turn to the Venice Commission for support, for help, for advice, and experts from the Venice Commission give their opinions. Of course, it's not binding, but it is very often treated as authoritative advice from a body of respected experts. So much for the Council of Europe. It is an extremely complex body with a lot of different bodies. I mean, there are literally hundreds of different sections and subsections in it. Quite often you read in the paper that the Council of Europe had said this or said that. Don't believe that, because it's not the Council of Europe as such. It's somebody inside the Council of Europe or attached to the Council of Europe that has said these things. Let me return. I'm going a bit between these different bodies. The OSCE started out as a diplomats' conference. It was not intended to be a people's organization. There were no sort of representatives of parliamentarians in it from the beginning. There were government people, government diplomats really representing governments. And they started with these three baskets, and they were not particularly effective in all three baskets. The economic side of it never really took off. And the human rights side was not very efficient either. But the Helsinki Declaration on the human rights part of the Helsinki Declaration was used very much by dissident movements in Central and Eastern Europe. Václav Havel is one good example. He started out this Carta 77, which was based on the Helsinki Declaration. And what Havel did was to say, look, Czech government, you have promised this and that. Now do what you have promised. So it was a kind of a protest movement from below that sought to discipline governments. And it didn't have immediate effects, but by slow sort of nagging, they had a considerable effect after all. And the OSCE has also a number of specialized persons who are looking at minorities' rights, as press, media freedom, and so on. So they are active, and they monitor elections. The OSCE has a special office in Warsaw called ODIHR, which is Office of Democratic Institutions, and they are trying to monitor the quality of democratic institutions all over Europe. Finally, then, the European Union. As I said, it started out as a commercial organization, as a market-oriented organization. There was no particular attention to human rights or rule of law. Rule of law only in the sense that the European Union, once they took away customs tariffs and when they liberalized trade, they were of course very interested in the member states' respect for these liberalizations. So they intervened a bit in the legal system of the member states, but otherwise they were not sort of a force for these European values. But this changed, and in the last few decades, particularly in the context of the enlargement of the European Union, there has been very much more attention turned to human rights issues. In the year 2000, a so-called convention, a meeting was convened where we drafted, and I say we because I was there for the Swedish government, we drafted a Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the EU has nowadays a Charter of Fundamental Rights, and this Charter of Fundamental Rights, which summarizes a bit the European Convention on Human Rights, plus the Social Charter and so on, a few other documents. That is now a kind of a body of principles, except legally binding nowadays, and it is employed very much by people who go to the European Court of Justice, that's the EU's Court of Justice, when they want to press a point against their government, then they can lean very much on this Charter of Fundamental Rights. So in an oblique way, as a latecomer, the European Union has also come to this camp of organizations that are paying attention to human rights. And the EU also has created a special body in Budapest, the Fundamental Rights Agency, FRA, which is trying to follow what's happening in the various member states. Now, let me end by saying that Lena is entirely right when she says that things are not going forward. They are not going forward necessarily in the Council of Europe. They are not going forward in the European Union, and they are not going forward in the OSCE in a number of respects. I'm not saying I'm not an all-out pessimist at all, but I think one has to admit that there have been a lot of adverse tendencies in all of these organizations. A lot of things that people hoped for 20 years ago, 30 years ago, have not materialized. There are still great problems. I mean, just take the issue of corruption. There's been a lot of action against corruption, but we live in an extremely corrupt Europe in many ways. There are a number of things that are not working out as they were intended, as we hoped that they would work out. I still believe that all of these three organizations are very helpful in many respects. They promote the good values in different ways, but nobody can claim that the result is satisfactory. We still have a lot of extremely severe, extremely serious shortcomings as far as human rights are concerned in Europe, and democracy is not working particularly well. We have a backlash. Nobody can hide from that. We have a backlash of people who are very much sort of fed up with their governments. There's a sort of various forms of populism, right, left, and center, and there are a number of extremely worrisome tendencies in contemporary Europe. So I am not trying to paint a rosy picture, but I do think that the institutions that we have created have done a few good things, and remain a positive instruments to continue work for these basic European values.